So I'm here in the very skylit studio of the Castleberg Trust. And I've improvised a storyboard with stuff around the studio so that we can use it for sequence climaxes today. And also just to show that you can make one of these storyboards anywhere, any blank wall, your garage, laundry room, the potting shed, your kid's magnetic whiteboard. And I've marked the sequence and act climaxes in blue on this board, not because I don't think that you've already got this, because I know you do, but I think that anything that puts a visual picture of your story map in your head is a good thing. So again, we have 4 acts. We have about 2 sequences per act. And every act you can put on 10 to 15 index cards, for a total of 40 to 60 scenes in your story. We know that act and sequence climaxes were developed in the early days of film because screenwriters had to account for those reel changes. So these climaxes are cliffhanger scenes that keep the audience wondering what's going to happen next. We know they're probably going to have the element of spectacle, and they will be genre specific. They give you the thrill promised by the genre. But also, there's certain story elements that we've been talking about that you tend to see as sequence and act climaxes because they're just so big and impactful. And when you start watching movies for these climactic scenes, you will see that they tend to fall in the same places in a story, over and over and over again. And when you're laying out your own story, that's kind of useful to know. So here we are with the sequence and act climaxes in blue. So I've started with what looks like a sequence or act climax in that very first scene. We know this from TV, right? They're teaser scenes or hook scenes. You see them in books as prologues. And those really lend themselves to certain genres, suspense, crime, horror, action, where you want to really show the audience that you're going to deliver on the thrills that you're promising them. So the teaser scene or prologue sets up the genre. It may show the initial crime. It may show the protagonist's ghost or the town ghost. Sometimes we see the villain's plan first, but you may or may not have one. The sequence 1 climax is most often the inciting incident or call to adventure. Your story doesn't really start until that scene, so it's a risk to put it any later than that. The risk is losing your reader. The Act 1 climax is very often the into the special world scene or sequence. It might be the plan or the first battle or test. And it's often a bunch of those at once. Act and sequence climaxes often combine several story elements at once. And this is a good thing to know for rewriting. You don't have to get them all in on the first pass. This act climax is also genre specific. So in a romance, it could be the first date. In a mystery, it might be a clue. It could be an attack by the villain in a crime story. In Act 2, the protagonist goes through a series of tests. So the sequence 3 climax could be a first or major test. Again, genre specific, so it could be a first kiss in a romance. It could be part of the investigation in a police procedural. It could be a subplot climax, like meeting the love interest in a non-romance or meeting the mentor. And sometimes these mid-act climaxes are more emotionally driven than the act climaxes, which tend to be bigger set pieces and more action-oriented. Now, the midpoint climax we know is a total game changer. It's a big loss or win or discovery. Very often there's a location change, and very often it's a location change from which there is no going back. It's often a now it's personal moment. Something happens that is intensely personal to the protagonist. The cliche is that their family is attacked. Sequence 5 is usually a big loss. Remember, in Act 2, Part 1, the protagonist is generally winning. In Act 2, Part 2, the protagonist is generally losing because their ghost or wound and their fears are holding them back. Also, because the protagonist has become obsessed with winning, they're making mistakes. So this big loss can be something that's actually the protagonist's fault. And the Act 2 climax, Sequence 6, is even worse. This is the all is lost scene. The protagonist hits bottom, and there seems to be absolutely no way out. Then comes the double punch of the revelation, the last piece of the puzzle they need, and that sudden rush of hope. And Act 3 is really the easiest of all. The Sequence 7 climax is usually a team battle that climaxes the storming the castle sequence. And the Sequence 8 climax is the final battle, the protagonist versus the antagonist, usually mano a mano. Then the resolution is its own kind of climax, but it's generally a more emotional and thoughtful one. So, of course, this is very, very general. But when you start looking at films more closely for structure, you will be amazed at how often you will see exactly those elements in exactly those places. So if you haven't done it already, I really hope you will take a break and take a movie and watch it for those sequence and act climaxes. Because if you can give your reader these sequence and act climaxes, you will sell your book.